When stars whisper secrets, the transport shuttle descended through violet clouds that swirled like cotton candy around the diplomatic vessel, and Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the viewing port with childlike wonder in her eyes because she had never seen anything quite like the planet Valthera before, with its 3 moons hanging in the sky, like silver ornaments, and its oceans that sparkled with bioluminescent waves that crashed against crystalline shores. She was only 20. 3 years old and fresh out of the diplomatic academy on Earth, where she had studied xenocultural relations for 4 years and had graduated at the top of her class. But nothing in those textbooks had prepared her for the reality of actually meeting an alien species face to face, and her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to break free. The Valtherans were a matriarchal society, and humanity had been trying to establish formal relations with them for nearly 2 years, but every ambassador sent before Sarah had returned empty-handed, because the Valtheran queens refused to negotiate with what they called the warlike sons of Earth, and it seemed they had no interest in speaking with human males at all, which was why Sarah had been chosen for this mission despite her youth and inexperience. The shuttle landed with a gentle thump on a platform, made of what looked like polished obsidian, and Sarah gathered her belongings with trembling hands, while her escort commander Lisa Chen gave her a reassuring smile and told her that everything would be fine and that she just needed to remember her training and be herself, because the Valtherans valued authenticity above all else. The airlock opened with a hiss and warm air rushed in, carrying the scent of something sweet and spicy like cinnamon mixed with jasmine, and Sarah stepped out onto the platform, where she was immediately greeted by 3 tall figures who stood waiting in the golden afternoon light. The Valtherans were breathtaking in a way that made Sarah forget how to breathe for several seconds, because they were humanoid, but taller than any human she had ever seen, with skin that shimmered with an opalescent quality that shifted between shades of blue and purple and silver depending on how the light hit them, and their eyes were large and luminous like pools of liquid mercury that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The one in the center stepped forward, and Sarah recognized her from the briefing files as Queen Lyra, who ruled the northern continent and was considered one of the most influential leaders on Valthera, and she wore flowing robes that seemed to be made of living light that rippled and changed color with her movements. Queen Lyra studied Sarah with those unsettling eyes for what felt like an eternity, before she spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes dancing in a breeze, and the translator device in Sarah's ear rendered her words into English, though some of the nuance was surely lost in translation. She said that Sarah was welcome in her domain, and that she was curious about this young human female who had come so far from home, and Sarah bowed deeply the way she had been taught and replied that she was honored to be there and hoped to build a bridge of understanding between their 2 peoples. Over the following days, Sarah was given a tour of the Valtheran capital city, which was built into the side of a mountain with buildings that grew organically from the rock itself like crystal formations in a cave, and everywhere she looked, there were wonders that defied explanation, like gardens where plants sang in harmonious choruses and fountains that flowed upward instead of down, in market squares where vendors sold items that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. But what struck Sarah most was how the Valtherans treated each other with a level of cooperation and mutual respect that seemed almost alien in itself, because there was no competition or aggression in their interactions, and they shared resources freely, without any concept of personal ownership beyond what they needed for daily life, and children were raised communally by extended family groups rather than isolated nuclear units. Queen Lyra spent several hours each day with Sarah, teaching her about Valtheran history and culture and philosophy, and Sarah learned that the Valtherans had once been a warlike species much like humanity, but they had nearly destroyed themselves in a global conflict that lasted for generations until their females rose up and took control and established a new social order based on cooperation rather than competition. The queen explained that Valtheran males still existed, but they were smaller and less intelligent than the females and lived in separate communities where they focused on art and music and other creative pursuits, while the females handled all matters of governance and science and defense, and Sarah found this reversal of Earth's traditional gender dynamics both fascinating and somewhat uncomfortable. One evening, Queen Lyra took Sarah to a private garden on a high terrace overlooking the city, and they sat together on a bench made of living wood that adjusted itself to support their bodies comfortably, and the queen poured them both cups of a luminous liquid that tasted like starlight and honey. The queen told Sarah that she had been watching humanity for many years and had seen the potential for greatness within their species, but also the seeds of their own destruction. Because humans clung to primitive notions of dominance and hierarchy that would eventually consume them if they did not evolve beyond such thinking. Sarah felt defensive at first and wanted to argue that humanity had made great progress and had achieved so much despite their flaws. But then she thought about the wars that still raged on Earth and the inequality that persisted between nations and genders and classes, and she realized that the queen was not entirely wrong. She asked Queen Lyra why the Valthorans had refused to negotiate with the male ambassadors, and the queen smiled sadly and said that she could not trust beings who still believed that might made right and who came to her world with warships in orbit as a show of strength rather than as a gesture of peace. Sarah protested that the warships were only there for protection and that humanity meant no harm, but the queen simply looked at her with those ancient eyes and asked why protection was necessary, if true peace was the goal, and Sarah had no answer to that. As weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself growing closer to Queen Lyra and her court, and she began to understand the Valtheran way of thinking, which prioritized the collective good over individual ambition and valued wisdom over strength and cooperation over competition. She also began to notice something strange happening to herself, because the longer she stayed on Valthera, the more she questioned the assumptions she had grown up with about how society should function, and what it meant to be human, and whether the competitive individualistic culture of Earth was really the pinnacle of civilization or just one possible path among many one day. Queen Lyra invited Sarah to attend a sacred ceremony in the crystal caves beneath the mountain, where the Valtherans communed with what they called the living memory of their world, and Sarah was honored to be included because no human had ever witnessed such a ritual before. In the caves, Sarah watched as hundreds of Valtherans joined their minds together in some kind of telepathic network, and she could feel the edges of their consciousness brushing against her own like gentle waves lapping at a shore, and in that moment she understood that the Valtherans were not just individuals, but also part of something larger, a collective consciousness that spanned their entire species. After the ceremony, Queen Lyra explained that this connection was what had allowed the Valtherans to overcome their violent past, because when you could feel the pain and joy of others as if it were your own, it became impossible to harm them without harming yourself. Sarah asked if humans could ever develop such an ability, and the queen said that all species had the potential for such evolution, but it required letting go of ego and fear, and the illusion of separation that kept beings isolated from one another. When it was finally time for Sarah to return to Earth, she felt torn, because part of her wanted to stay on Valthera forever and learn everything the queen had to teach, while another part of her knew that her real purpose was to bring this knowledge back to her own people and help them find a better path forward. Queen Lyra gave Sarah a gift before she left, which was a small crystal that glowed with an inner light, and the queen said that it contained a fragment of the Valtheran collective memory and would help Sarah remember what she had learned when she was back among her own kind. On the shuttle ride home, Sarah clutched the crystal in her hand and watched Valthera shrink into the distance, until it was just another bright point of light among the stars, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same for her again, because she had seen what humanity could become if they were brave enough to change. When she arrived back on Earth and delivered her report to the diplomatic council, they were disappointed that she had not secured a formal treaty or trade agreement, but Sarah told them that the Valtherans had given humanity something far more valuable, which was a vision of what they could evolve into if they chose cooperation over competition and wisdom over strength. Some council members dismissed her words as naive idealism, and others accused her of being brainwashed by alien propaganda. But a few listened with open minds and hearts, and Sarah knew that seeds had been planted that would one day grow into something beautiful. Years later, when humanity finally achieved the social and psychological evolution necessary to join the